In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the world held its breath. The largest amphibious invasion in history was about to unfold along the Normandy coast. But among the countless soldiers who stormed the beaches that morning, one small, elite unit had been given a task that seemed almost suicidal: the men of the U.S. Army's 2nd Ranger Battalion. Their mission: to climb the sheer 100-foot cliffs of Pointe, WWII and silence the 6 heavy German 155mm guns believed to be positioned there. If they failed, the beaches of Omaha and Utah, and the entire D-Day operation, could be devastated by the enemy's long-range fire. As dawn approached, the English Channel churned violently beneath them. The Rangers, 225 men strong under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, crammed into British landing craft known as LCAs. They had trained for months in secrecy, scaling cliffs in southern England, learning how to use ropes, grapnels, and rocket-fired hooks. Yet nothing could prepare them for what awaited on the real cliffs of Normandy. Cliffs rising straight from the sea, fortified by German bunkers, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. Pointe du Hoc itself jutted into the sea like a dagger, its strategic value undeniable. From this promontory, the Germans could sweep both Omaha and Utah beaches with interlocking artillery fire. Allied intelligence photographs had confirmed the presence of 6 massive 155mm French-made guns, weapons with a range of nearly 25,000 yards. Destroying them was essential to protect the invasion. But as Rudder's men closed in on the coast, a darker question loomed: were the guns even still there? The Channel was merciless that morning. Strong currents and a rising tide pushed many of the Rangers' landing craft off course. Rudder's force was supposed to land at 6:30, but the current dragged them eastward, costing precious minutes. The naval bombardment meant to soften the German defenses had already lifted, and by the time the Rangers approached the shore, the enemy was fully alert. From above, German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division rained fire down upon them. Machine guns, mortars, and grenades exploding across the narrow strip of beach. The Rangers' landing craft slammed into rocks and obstacles, some destroyed before they could even reach the sand. Men were thrown into the freezing surf, weighed down by gear. "We had to swim for it," one survivor later recalled. "The water was red before we even touched the cliffs." Amidst the chaos, the rockets that carried grappling hooks misfired in the wet salt air. Some ropes fell short, others burned or snapped under enemy fire. Yet somehow, the Rangers began to climb. Scaling the cliffs was a feat of raw willpower. Using knives, bayonets, and their own hands, men clawed their way upward as German defenders leaned over the edge, dropping grenades and pouring machine gun fire straight down. "The only thing that kept me moving," Private Leonard Lommel said years later, "was knowing the men below would die if those guns stayed in place." Bit by bit, the Rangers reached the top, pulling each other over the edge into a moonscape of craters and smoke. When the first Rangers crested the cliffs around 7:08, they expected to see the concrete gun emplacements roaring with fire. Instead, they found nothing. The casemates stood empty, shattered by the naval bombardment, but the great guns they'd risked everything to destroy were gone. In their place were wooden telephone poles and dummy barrels, decoys built to fool Allied reconnaissance. It was a stunning revelation. Had the Germans moved the weapons elsewhere, or had Allied intelligence been wrong all along? The Rangers were cut off from the main invasion force, their radios were damaged, and reinforcements from the 5th Battalion had been delayed. They now held a barren cliff top with no idea where their true objective had gone. From his command post, Rudder tried to make sense of the situation. "We must locate those guns," he told his men. "They're still out there." Patrols were sent out through the smoke and chaos to search the fields and hedgerows inland. Somewhere close, the guns waited, hidden, silent, and ready to strike. Time was running out, and every minute the mystery deepened. As the sun rose higher over Normandy, the sounds of battle spread across the beaches below. The men at Pointe du Hoc were alone, isolated, under fire, and unsure if their sacrifice would even matter. Yet they pressed on, clinging to one purpose: find the guns before it was too late. The cliffs behind them were stained with blood. Their comrades' bodies lay on the beach below. But ahead, beyond the shattered casemates and smoking craters, A dark truth was beginning to reveal itself, one that would change everything the Rangers thought they knew about their mission. And so, as Part 1 closes, the question remains, if the guns of Pointe du Hoc weren't here, then where were they? The top of Pointe du Hoc was a wasteland, a desolate field of craters, smoke, and the stench of cordite. The Rangers, having clawed their way up the cliffs through machine gun fire and falling debris, now stood atop what looked like the surface of the moon. The once formidable German position was silent, its bunkers shattered and the air thick with dust. Yet the silence was not victory, it was uncertainty. The guns were gone. The very weapons that had justified this suicidal assault had vanished. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder quickly established a makeshift command post near a destroyed observation bunker. His Rangers, exhausted, bleeding, but alive, began to secure the perimeter. "We had no choice," one Ranger later recalled. "We had to assume the enemy was watching us." Through the smoke, they could see the beaches below, where the chaos of D-Day still raged. From their elevated position, they could hear the crackle of machine guns and the distant thunder of naval guns striking inland targets. Yet up here, they were alone, a small detachment stranded between sea and German lines. Of the 225 Rangers who had set out that morning, nearly a third were already dead or missing. The losses had come not only from enemy fire but from the unforgiving sea itself. Landing craft had capsized or been ripped apart by artillery. Men drowned in full gear, dragged under by the surf. Others were shot in the water before they even reached the cliffs. Still, those who survived pressed upward, embodying the Ranger motto, "Rangers, lead the way." Now, standing at the top, they faced a cruel twist of fate. The casemates were empty. The positions, once believed to house 6 heavy 155mm guns, were filled only with decoys. Telephone poles wrapped in camouflage netting and painted to look like barrels. The Rangers had been sent to destroy an illusion. "We were stunned," Sergeant Charles Parker would later recall. "Everything we'd risked our lives for wasn't even there." Intelligence reports had been clear. Aerial reconnaissance from May 1944 showed 6 gun emplacements under construction. Allied analysts concluded they were ready to fire on D-Day. But the Germans had been one step ahead. Weeks earlier, the guns had been moved inland, perhaps to avoid naval bombardment or to prepare for a counterattack. No one knew exactly when or to where. The mystery deepened as German resistance began to stiffen. Snipers fired from hidden positions among the rubble. Mortar rounds crashed down from inland batteries. The Rangers, low on ammunition and cut off from the beach, dug in wherever they could, inside craters, behind broken concrete, using captured weapons when their own ran dry. "It was like being trapped in a shooting gallery," one survivor said. "We couldn't move without drawing fire." Rudder's radio operators tried to contact the main invasion force, but communication was nearly impossible. The cliffs and heavy bombardment interfered with their sets. When a message finally broke through to headquarters aboard the USS Ancon, it was simple and grim: situation critical. Need ammunition and reinforcements. Many casualties. Reinforcements, however, would not come for hours, and many of those headed their way would never arrive. Out to sea, the 5th Ranger Battalion, commanded by Major Max Schneider, received orders to land and support Rudder's men. But when they reached the shore, German fire from the Vierville Draw and the chaos on Omaha Beach forced a change of plan. General Norman Cota, the assistant division commander of the 29th Infantry Division, turned to the Rangers and gave the words that would enter legend: "Rangers, lead the way." The 5th Battalion joined the assault on Omaha instead, leaving Rudder's isolated force on Pointe du Hoc to fend for itself. By midday, the Rangers on the cliffs realized they were trapped. German counterattacks were forming inland. Ammunition was running dangerously low. The enemy still held the surrounding fields and bunkers, and the Rangers' small perimeter was barely defensible. Yet amid the chaos, Rudder refused to give up. He ordered reconnaissance patrols to move cautiously inland, their task: locate the missing guns at any cost. The tension was unbearable. Every step into the hedgerows could mean an ambush. But without the guns destroyed, the beaches below remained in danger. Small teams crept through the dense Norman farmland, listening for artillery fire, searching for tracks or camouflage nets. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, the weapons were hidden, perhaps just a few hundred meters away, silent but ready. By late afternoon, sporadic reports of German movement came in. Sniper fire intensified. "We were surrounded," said Corporal Jack Kuhn. "But we weren't beaten." Rudder's men dug deeper, using anything they could find for cover. The cliff edge became a makeshift fortress, defended by sheer determination and the unspoken fear that help might never arrive. As night fell over the cliffs, the wind howled across the craters and shattered bunkers. The Rangers huddled together, counting their ammunition and tending to the wounded. Somewhere out in the darkness, the missing guns of Pointe du Hoc waited, silent, hidden, and deadly. The Rangers didn't yet know it, but finding them would require courage beyond anything they had already shown. The first day of D-Day was ending, but for the men of Pointe du Hoc, the battle, and the mystery, was only just beginning. The dawn of June 7, 1944, the second day of the invasion, rose over a shattered landscape. Smoke still curled from the blackened craters of Pointe du Hoc. The sounds of distant gunfire echoed inland, mingling with the cries of wounded men who had survived the hellish climb the day before. For the 2nd Ranger Battalion, the initial mission had turned into something far different from what they had been briefed. They had taken the cliffs, but their objective, the 6 German 155mm guns, had vanished without a trace. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder surveyed the field from his forward position. The cliffside was now a fortress of destruction, cratered earth, shattered bunkers, and splintered timber. Around him, fewer than 150 Rangers remained able to fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Communication with Allied forces below was still unreliable. The naval bombardment that had once protected them had ceased, replaced by eerie silence and the distant rumble of tank fire near Omaha Beach. The question that haunted them all was simple. Where were the guns? Allied intelligence, gathered from aerial reconnaissance and French resistance reports, had insisted they were positioned atop these cliffs. Yet now, as the Rangers combed through the ruins, they found only empty casemates, each one a concrete shell filled with debris and twisted metal. Not a single gun barrel remained. It was as if the weapons had never existed. But the Germans were still fighting. From the fields beyond the cliff, snipers and mortar crews harassed the Ranger positions relentlessly. Every movement drew fire. Men dashed between shell holes, clutching carbines and grenades, crawling from one crater to the next. The ground was alive with bullets, remembered Sergeant Lommel. We couldn't move without being pinned down. The Rangers knew they couldn't simply hold their ground, they needed to complete their mission. Rudder gathered his officers and ordered reconnaissance patrols to sweep inland. The guns were moved. "They're out there somewhere," he told them. "Find them before they find us." Two-man teams set out cautiously through the Norman bocage, a maze of thick hedgerows, dirt paths, and farmland. Visibility was almost zero. The terrain favored the defenders. Every bush could conceal a rifle. Every farmhouse could hide a machine gun. Among the patrols was Sergeant Leonard Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn of D Company. Both were seasoned Rangers, having trained for months for this exact operation. Moving silently through the hedgerows, they advanced roughly half a mile south of Pointe du Hoc. The air was tense, filled with the smell of damp earth and cordite. Then, near a dirt farm road, they saw something that made them stop dead in their tracks. Camouflaged beneath the trees were 5 long gun barrels, the missing 155mm French howitzers. They were lined up in firing position, aimed toward Utah and Omaha beaches, ready to unleash devastation on the Allied landings below. Around them lay boxes of ammunition and range-finding equipment. The guns had been moved inland just before the invasion, hidden to escape the naval bombardment. But now, with the Rangers' assault disrupting communications, the Germans had not yet manned them. Lommel and Kuhn realized they had mere minutes before the gunners could return. They had no explosives heavy enough to destroy the artillery, only thermite grenades. Acting fast, Lommel jammed the grenades into the elevation and traverse mechanisms of each gun, pulling the pins and melting the metal gears beyond repair. One by one, the weapons hissed and smoked, their firing mechanisms fusing shut. The Rangers then smashed the rangefinders and burned the ammunition stores, rendering the entire battery useless. It was an act of audacious improvisation, and one of the most critical moments of D-Day. Without a single shot fired, 2 Rangers had eliminated a direct threat to tens of thousands of men still landing on the beaches. "It took us just minutes," Lommel recalled later, "but it could have saved thousands of lives." Their actions went unreported for hours, as radio contact remained spotty. But by the time the Germans realized what had happened, it was too late. Meanwhile, back at the cliff, the remaining Rangers fought to hold their precarious position. German counterattacks grew stronger. Mortar fire pounded the bluff. Ammunition ran low, and casualties mounted. The men used captured German weapons and scavenged supplies to stay in the fight. "We didn't think about retreat," said Private First Class Willard Noon. "There was nowhere to go but down the cliffs, and the sea was still full of wreckage and bodies." By late morning, Lommel and Kuhn returned to report their success. Rudder, upon hearing the news, realized the full magnitude of what they had done. The guns of Pointe du Hoc were destroyed. The mission had been a success, but the battle was far from over. Now, they would have to survive the relentless German attempts to reclaim the position. That night, German infantry probed the Ranger perimeter. The enemy knew the Americans were cut off and exhausted. Flares lit the sky as machine guns and mortars opened up once more. The Rangers huddled in their foxholes, clinging to the ground they'd bled for. They had found and destroyed the missing guns, but in doing so, they had exposed their position and ensured the enemy's fury. In the darkness, with the sea crashing far below and the cliffs trembling under bombardment, the Rangers held fast. They had completed their mission, but now they faced a new one: survival. As the night dragged on, the line between victory and annihilation blurred. Reinforcements had still not arrived, and the men of Pointe du Hoc wondered whether their story would ever be told. The guns were gone, but the battle, and the mystery of how the Rangers would endure, was just beginning to unfold. By the morning of June 8, 1944, the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were running on fumes. For 48 hours, they had fought, dug, and bled on the windswept cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. The great guns that had once threatened the Normandy beaches were gone, destroyed by the daring of 2 Rangers, Lommel and Kuhn. But the cost of that success was becoming clear. They were isolated, surrounded, and outnumbered. The Rangers had done what they came to do, yet now they had to survive long enough for anyone to know it. The terrain that had seemed an obstacle 2 days before was now their only defense. The craters from the naval bombardment became foxholes. The shattered concrete bunkers became shelters against mortar fire. German counterattacks came in waves from the east and south, testing the perimeter with machine guns and grenades. The men could hear the clatter of panzer tracks in the distance, but no tanks appeared. Perhaps the terrain was too broken, or perhaps the Germans were conserving their armor for Omaha. Whatever the reason, the Rangers knew they couldn't rely on luck much longer. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, wounded by shrapnel and barely able to stand, continued to direct the defense from a small trench near the cliff's edge. His radioman kept trying to raise headquarters, sending bursts of static-filled messages into the air. "Still holding. Need ammo. Heavy losses." Replies were few and garbled. To the Allied fleet offshore, Pointe du Hoc looked silent. No signal flares, no movement. Some wondered if Rudder's command had been wiped out entirely. Inside the perimeter, supplies were nearly gone. The Rangers scavenged German weapons and ammunition, pulling rounds from enemy pouches and stripping fallen soldiers of their gear. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded men were treated with torn shirts as bandages and rainwater collected in helmets. "We had nothing left but our will," Sergeant Charles Parker remembered. And even that was wearing thin. The German counterattacks intensified as the day wore on. Infantry from the 914th Grenadier Regiment, part of the 352nd Division, attempted to retake the high ground. Their officers knew that losing Pointe du Hoc meant losing control of the flank between Omaha and Utah beaches. They came from the hedgerows and gullies, using smoke grenades to conceal their advance. The Rangers responded with captured MG-42s, bars, and rifles scavenged from the fallen. The sound of automatic fire echoed off the cliffs, mingling with the distant rumble of the naval bombardment still pounding targets inland. Amid the chaos, small moments of courage defined the day. Private First Class Jack Eubanks, despite being wounded, crawled 50 yards under fire to drag 2 comrades back to safety. Lieutenant Charles Parker, leading a counterattack against a German push, was shot through the leg but refused evacuation. "If we fall back," he told his men, "we fall into the sea." Those words became the unspoken truth of their stand. As the Rangers fought for survival, their discovery of the missing guns began to filter through the Allied chain of command. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed smoke rising from the inland positions where Lommel and Kuhn had destroyed the artillery. The threat to Omaha and Utah had indeed been neutralized. Yet, in the confusion of the invasion, few understood the price being paid by the men who had made it possible. By the afternoon, the weather turned. Rain swept across the cliffs, turning the bomb craters into muddy pits. The Rangers shivered in their soaked uniforms, their weapons slick with grime. Food was nearly gone. They chewed chocolate bars and cold rations, if they had any left. A few men dared to look over the cliff's edge, searching for signs of friendly ships, but all they saw was the endless gray of the channel. At dusk, German artillery from inland positions began a new bombardment. Shells screamed overhead, detonating among the craters. One struck near Rudder's command post, throwing him to the ground and burying his map table in dirt. Dazed and bleeding, he refused evacuation again. "Tell them we still hold Pointe du Hoc," he muttered to his adjutant. "Tell them we're not leaving." Night came, bringing no rest. Flares lit the sky, revealing shifting figures in the darkness. The Rangers fired at shadows, unsure where the enemy was coming from. Every rustle of wind through the grass sounded like movement. "It was the longest night of my life," said Corporal Willard Noon. "We were ghosts fighting ghosts." By the early hours of June 9th, ammunition was almost gone. Some Rangers prepared for hand-to-hand combat, fixing bayonets and clutching grenades. They didn't know that help was finally on its way. From Omaha Beach, elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion and the 116th Infantry Regiment had begun pushing inland, fighting through German resistance to reach their stranded comrades. But as dawn broke once again over the cliffs of Normandy, the Rangers still didn't know if anyone was coming. They had destroyed the guns, held the cliffs, and endured 2 days of constant battle. Yet now, with their strength fading and the enemy massing once more, a grim question remained: how long could they hold? The sea pounded against the rocks below. The wind tore at the tattered American flags planted among the craters. Somewhere out there, reinforcements were fighting their way closer. But until they arrived, the fate of the men of Pointe du Hoc would hang by a thread, a story of endurance, courage, and mystery still unfolding in the shadow of the cliffs. June 9, 1944. The third day atop Pointe du Hoc. The cliffs that had once symbolized victory now felt like a prison. The surviving Rangers, barely 90 men still able to fight, clung to their positions with what little ammunition they had left. Every crater had become a grave or a foxhole. Every hour brought new waves of German fire. Their mission had succeeded, but the cost of holding that success was becoming unbearable. The men were haggard, sleepless, and soaked to the bone. For 2 days and nights, they had endured relentless mortar fire, sniper shots, and probing attacks from all directions. The once proud battalion was reduced to fragments of companies. Wounded men lay among the ruins, whispering for water that had long since run out. The medics worked with what they could find: field dressings, strips of torn uniform, and captured German morphine syrettes. In the chaos, no one knew how many were dead, how many missing, or how many simply too wounded to fight. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder remained conscious, though barely. Shrapnel had torn into his leg, and he was suffering from shock and blood loss. His men begged him to take shelter deeper in the bunker, but he refused. "If I go down," he said, "we all go down." His voice, hoarse and steady, became the thread that held the remnants of the unit together. The Germans continued to test the perimeter, determined to reclaim the cliffs. They advanced through the hedgerows in tight groups, laying down suppressive fire as they crept closer. Each time, the Rangers repelled them, but each defense came at a higher cost. It was like beating back a tide, Sergeant Parker recalled. Every time we thought they'd stopped, another wave came. Some Rangers resorted to using captured German rifles when their own ran dry. Others hurled back enemy grenades seconds before detonation. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burnt powder. At times, the Germans came so close that the fighting turned hand-to-hand. "We were running on instinct," said Private Ralph Jelinas. "You didn't think about the next hour. You just fought to stay alive." Communication with headquarters was still uncertain. Rudder's last clear radio message had been transmitted the night before: enemy counterattacking. Casualties heavy. We hold. The words, brief and resolute, reached Allied command aboard the USS Ancon. But confusion reigned. Some believed Rudder's command had been annihilated. Others thought the Rangers were cut off but still resisting. No one knew for sure. As morning faded into afternoon, the sounds of distant gunfire drifted closer. It was not the enemy this time, it was friendly fire. Off to the south, elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion and the 116th Infantry Regiment were advancing from Omaha Beach. They had fought through 2 days of resistance, pushing inland toward the cliffs. The men of Pointe du Hoc didn't yet know it, but rescue was finally within reach. Until then, they kept fighting. German mortar rounds pounded the ridge, sending shards of rock and steel flying. One blast struck near the command post, collapsing the roof and burying 2 men alive. Their comrades dug them out with their bare hands, gasping in the dust-filled air. The Rangers were past exhaustion, but the instinct to hold the line remained unbroken. Late that afternoon, a German patrol launched a final major assault from the east. Backed by machine gun fire and mortars, they charged toward the Ranger lines. The Americans responded with everything they had left: rifle fire, grenades, even captured Panzerfausts turned against the attackers. The fighting raged for nearly an hour before the Germans broke off, leaving dozens of bodies scattered across the field. The Rangers had held, but barely. Then, as evening fell and the gunfire subsided, a new sound emerged from the south: the unmistakable rhythm of American voices. Through the smoke and haze, figures appeared on the horizon. Soldiers of the 5th Rangers and 116th Infantry. Reinforcements had arrived at last. The relief was overwhelming. Men wept openly as they realized they were no longer alone. "We saw the helmets," one ranger said, "and it was like seeing the sunrise for the first time." The newcomers climbed the cliffs, stepping into the nightmare that had been the Rangers' world for 3 days. What they found stunned them: craters filled with wounded, bunkers half collapsed, and men who looked like ghosts, filthy, hollow-eyed, and still clutching their rifles. When the count was finally made, the numbers told the story. Of the 225 Rangers who had started the mission on D-Day morning, only about 90 remained combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. The price of success at Pointe du Hoc had been extraordinary. But their mission, the destruction of the guns, had saved untold lives on Omaha and Utah beaches. As the medics tended to the wounded and the reinforcements secured the area, Rudder finally allowed himself to be carried from the line. His men saluted him as he passed. "We did our job," he murmured, barely conscious. "Now they can finish theirs." The battle for Pointe du Hoc was over, but the mystery of its aftermath was only beginning. Reports conflicted, timelines blurred, and the full story of what the Rangers endured in those 3 days would take decades to emerge. Even now, among the ruins of the cliffs, one question lingered like the echo of the waves below. How many men had vanished in those hours between the assault and the rescue? Never found, never recorded, lost to the sea and the silence of history? When the guns fell silent on June 9, 1944, Pointe du Hoc was a graveyard. The smoke had lifted, the Germans had withdrawn, and the sea below shimmered with a deceptive calm. What remained of the 2nd Ranger Battalion stood among the ruins of their victory, bloodied, exhausted, and forever changed. They had achieved what many thought impossible: scaling the cliffs, finding the missing guns, and destroying them before they could rain fire upon the beaches. Yet, in the fog of war that followed, much of their story would fade into obscurity. The reinforcements from the 5th Ranger Battalion and the 116th Infantry Regiment secured the area by nightfall. Medics moved among the wounded, marking those who could be saved. Corpsmen whispered prayers over those who couldn't. The cliffs were littered with shattered helmets and torn uniforms, mute testimony to the men who had fought there. For every ranger still standing, 2 were gone. Their bodies were buried hastily in makeshift graves near the edge of the bluff, marked with rifles and dog tags pressed into the soil. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder was evacuated on a stretcher, his uniform soaked in blood. He had refused to leave until the last possible moment. When asked later how his men had endured, he simply said, "They knew what had to be done, and they did it." His words captured the essence of the Rangers' mission and their sacrifice, but not the full truth of what they had endured. That truth would remain fragmented, scattered among after-action reports, personal letters, and fading memories. In the immediate aftermath, confusion reigned. Some Allied units reported that Pointe du Hoc had been completely destroyed, its defenders annihilated. Others claimed it had fallen back into German hands. Communications breakdowns, overlapping operations, and the chaos of the invasion made it difficult to separate fact from rumor. When official casualty lists were compiled weeks later, several Rangers were listed as missing, presumed dead. Yet no trace of them was ever found. Some may have fallen into the sea during the assault, others were buried by shellfire, their names never recorded on any roll call. They became the Forgotten Rangers, their stories swallowed by the cliffs they had conquered. Over time, the significance of the mission was overshadowed by the larger battles of Normandy, Omaha, Corentin, St. Lo. Pointe du Hoc became a footnote, its story known only to a few veterans and historians. But for those who had been there, it was a place haunted by memory. Sergeant Leonard Lommel, one of the men who destroyed the guns, would later say, "We weren't heroes. We were just doing our job. But what we saw up there, no one can ever really understand unless they were with us." In the decades that followed, the details of what happened at Pointe du Hoc were pieced together slowly, like fragments of a broken film reel. Veterans' accounts revealed inconsistencies in the timelines. Men remembered different times for the landings, for the discovery of the guns, for the counterattacks. Some claimed certain platoons had vanished entirely, cut off in the fog and never seen again. Historians still debate whether every ranger who died on the cliffs has been accounted for. The rugged landscape itself, with its deep craters and shifting soil, has never fully surrendered its secrets. Yet the legacy of that mission endures. On June 6, 1984, 40 years after D-Day, President Ronald Reagan stood atop Pointe du Hoc to commemorate the battle. Before him stood a small group of surviving Rangers, their faces weathered but proud. Behind them, the cliffs rose like silent sentinels over the sea. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc," Reagan said in his address. "These are the men who took the cliffs, who held the ground, who helped free a continent." His words etched their story back into history, restoring the memory that had once teetered on the edge of forgetting. Today, visitors to Pointe du Hoc walk among preserved craters and the remains of German bunkers. The sea air still smells of salt and stone, the wind still howls across the cliffs, and the waves still crash against the rocks far below, just as they did on that June morning in 1944. Each year, small flags and flowers appear beside the names of the fallen Rangers, some of whom have no known grave. Their silence tells its own story, not of glory or triumph, but of duty carried to its absolute limit. The mystery of Pointe du Hoc lies not in the missing guns, but in the men themselves, the ones who climbed when logic said it couldn't be done, who fought when retreat was impossible, and who vanished into the smoke and sea without recognition. Their courage ensured the success of D-Day, yet their suffering remained largely untold. Even now, beneath the grass and soil of Normandy, there may still lie the remains of those forgotten Rangers, their identities erased by time but their legacy carved into history. And so, as the waves continue to strike the base of the cliffs, the story of Pointe du Hoc endures, not as a tale of lost men, but of men who refused to be lost. A story of resolve, sacrifice, and quiet mystery. A story of the forgotten U.S. Rangers, who climbed into history and disappeared into legend.